The sky above the alien world was a deep, strange purple, streaked with thin clouds that shimmered like liquid metal. Beneath it, in a vast city of towering spires and glowing lights, a single human man stood out like a shadow cast in daylight. His hands were bound, his clothes torn and stained, and his eyes that had once held hope now flickered with a mixture of pain, fear, and something darker, a simmering fire that refused to die. This was Keon, a man stolen from Earth, ripped from everything he knew, now a prisoner in an empire far beyond his comprehension. But even in chains, Keon's spirit had not been crushed, captured during a brutal raid on a peaceful colony near the edge of the known galaxy. Keon had become just another prize for the ruling alien species known as the Varkans. To them, humans were little more than slaves' tools to be used, broken and discarded when no longer useful. The Varkans ruled their vast empire with an iron grip, crushing any sign of rebellion without mercy. Keon's fate was meant to be a warning to others. Resist, and you will suffer. For weeks, Keon had been held in a cold, dark cell beneath the citadel. The air smelled of oil and rust, and the walls seemed to close in with every passing day. Captors came and went, like shadows silent, cruel, and indifferent to his suffering. They gave him only enough food to survive, mocked his language and his stubborn refusal to obey. He had been beaten, starved, and humiliated, yet he refused to break. Inside, a storm was growing. Keon's mind wandered off into Earth, to the blue skies and green fields, to the family he might never see again. Memories flooded him in painful waves. His mother's laughter, the taste of fresh bread, the feel of the sun on his face. Those memories were a lifeline, a reminder of who he was beneath the chains and bruises. But the harder he held on, the more the Varkans tried to strip him of his humanity. They called him a savage, a mistake, a weak species unworthy of respect. They did not understand that in every human heart burned a flame of resistance, no matter how dark the prison. One evening, as Keon lay on the cold stone floor, he heard footsteps approaching, deliberate, slow, and heavy. The cell door hissed open, revealing a figure cloaked in the deep blue robes of the Varkan elite. The figure's face was hidden behind a mask, but the presence alone sent a chill down Keon's spine. "You're different," the voice said, smooth and cold. "Most humans break quickly, but you have something rare, a fire they say only legends speak of." Keon's eyes narrowed. "I am not your prisoner. I am a man." The figure chuckled softly, the sound hollow in the silence. "A man, yes, but here you are property, and property is meant to obey. What is it that keeps your spirit alive? Hope, revenge, or something?" "More dangerous?" Keon said nothing. He knew better than to reveal his thoughts, but inside, he felt the truth burning brighter. Revenge was no longer just a word. It was a promise, a vow made to himself and to all those who had suffered under the Varkans' rule. Days passed. Keon endured more tests, more attempts to break him. But every time the Varkans pushed, he pushed back harder. They tried to teach him their language, their customs, to strip away his identity. Instead, Keon studied them, learning their weaknesses, their fears. The cracks in their cold empire, in the shadows of the citadel, whispers of rebellion stirred. Other prisoners, other slaves began to notice the flicker of defiance in Keon's eyes. Rumors spread among the oppressed that this human was no ordinary captive, that he carried within him the spirit of a warrior, a leader who might one day change everything. Keon knew the truth in their whispers. He was not alone. Around him, the seeds of resistance were taking root, watered by pain and nurtured by hope. If he could survive, if he could find allies, they could fight back. Not just to escape, but to strike at the heart of the Varkan Empire. One night, under the cold gaze of a pale moon, Keon felt the stirrings of a plan forming. It was risky, impossible, some would say, but it was the only way. He began to reach out in subtle ways, sending signals, testing trust, finding those who still dared to dream of freedom. The Varkans were arrogant. They believed their empire was eternal, their power absolute. They did not see the storm gathering beneath their feet. The storm, fueled by the fire of a single human who refused to be broken, in the quiet hours before dawn. Keon stood alone on the rooftop of the prison block, looking out at the sprawling city beneath him. The stars glittered cold and distant, but in his heart a new light shone bright, fierce, and unyielding. They had taken his freedom, they had taken his home, but they had not taken his soul, and soon they would learn that enslaving a human was the greatest mistake they had ever made. The cold stone walls of the prison echoed with whispers quiet, cautious, but full of hope. Keon had become more than just a prisoner. He was becoming a symbol. Word spread quickly among the enslaved, and even some of the low-ranking guards began to notice the change in the man once thought broken. The fire inside Keon's eyes was unmistakable, a fire that refused to be snuffed out. No matter how tightly the chains or harsh the punishment, Keon understood that alone. He was nothing against the vast might of the Varkan Empire. But together, the enslaved could become a force that even the Council of Archons would fear. Slowly, carefully, he began to build connections. He spoke in quiet tones during shared meals, exchanged coded glances during labor shifts, and listened. 2 stories of others who had lost everything, but had not lost their will to fight. His presence was magnetic. Where Keon went, hope followed, even in the darkest corners of the Empire's dungeons. He spoke not only of freedom, but of revenge, not the angry vengeance of a broken man, but the cold, calculated kind that comes with patience and planning. His words stirred something deep within those who had long ago stopped dreaming. The Empire, for all its power, had weaknesses. Keon listened and learned. The Varkans were proud and cruel, but they relied heavily on complex technology, rigid hierarchies, and a fragile system of control. Any crack in that system could become a way and a secret door to escape, a hidden weakness in a weapon, or a divided enemy ripe for exploitation. Among the enslaved were engineers, scientists, former soldiers, and spies from many worlds the Varkans had conquered. Each had knowledge that, combined with Keon's courage and leadership, could turn the tide. Together, they shared what little they had: a smuggled tool here, a whispered secret there. Every small act became a thread in a web of resistance. But the Varkans were not blind. Their elite commanders grew suspicious. The prison guards tightened security, increased patrols, and punished any hint of defiance with brutal force. Yet, even under the harshest conditions, the spark of rebellion did not die. It only grew stronger. Keon's greatest challenge was to keep the rebellion hidden, a shadow moving silently beneath the Empire's gaze. He trained his allies in stealth, in silent communication, in survival. Every day was a test, every moment a balance between hope and fear. Then came the day when the rebellion struck its first blow. It was not a grand battle, but a carefully planned sabotage. A vital supply line, shipment of weapons and fuel destined for the front lines, was destroyed. The explosions echoed through the Varkan military network, sowing confusion and panic. The council was furious. They demanded swift justice, brutal retaliation. But Keon and his rebels vanished into the shadows before the full weight of their wrath could fall. Their message was clear. Humanity would not be enslaved. They would fight, and they would win. With each success, the rebellion grew bolder. Allies from unexpected places reached out, spies within the Varkan ranks, sympathetic. Aliens tired of tyranny, even some mercenaries, who saw in Keon a chance for a greater purpose. Earth, once forgotten, was becoming a beacon of resistance. Yet, the cost was high. Every victory came with loss. Friends were captured, tortured, and lost to the Empire's cruelty. But Keon's resolve never wavered, carried their memory as armor and motivation, fueling his relentless drive. Behind closed doors, in hidden tunnels and secret rooms, Keon forged a new vision, not just to escape, but to reclaim. To rise from the ashes of slavery and take the Empire itself. Tenacious, dangerous, but it was the only way. The final step of preparation loomed. A daring strike at the heart of the Varkan command, a blow so powerful it could shake the Empire to its core. But the risk was enormous. Failure meant death, and the loss of hope for all who looked to him. As the night deepened, Kian stood once again on the rooftop of his prison block. The stars above seemed colder than before, the weight of the coming battle pressing down. But inside, the fire burned brighter than ever. They had enslaved a human, yes, but they had awakened a force they could not control. The Empire's fall had begun. The rebellion's success was no longer a secret, whispered only in shadows. It began to shake the very foundations of the Varkon Empire. What started as small acts of defiance had grown into a coordinated force, a rising storm that threatened to sweep away centuries of control and cruelty. Kian's name spread like wildfire among the enslaved, and even whispered nervously among some of the alien soldiers. He was no longer just a captive, he was a leader, a symbol of hope. In the spark that lit a revolution, Kian understood that to challenge an empire, brute force alone would never be enough. The Varkans were too strong, their armies too vast, and their technology far superior. So he turned to the greatest weapon he had, his mind. Every plan, every move was carefully calculated. He studied the enemy's routines, learned their communication codes, and discovered hidden divisions between their leaders. Power in the Empire was not unified. It was a fragile web of alliances, rivalries, and secrets. Kian knew that by exploiting these cracks, he could topple giants. Under Kian's leadership, the rebels became more than just fighters. They became shadows, ghosts in the machinery of the Empire. They struck where the Varkans least expected. Supply convoys disappeared. Communication arrays were sabotaged, and weapons caches destroyed. These were not just attacks. They were messages, proof that the enslaved would no longer bow to tyranny. But with every victory came increased danger. The Council dispatched their elite enforcers, warriors feared across the galaxy for their ruthlessness and skill. These hunters were relentless, tracking rebels with deadly precision. Many of Kian's closest allies were captured or killed, leaving scars deeper than any wound. The price of rebellion was high, but giving up was not an option. Among the rebels was a remarkable group of allies, former scientists who had been forced to work on cruel weapons, engineers who had once built the very machines now used against them, and warriors who refused to surrender their honor. Each brought unique skills, turning the rebellion into a complex network of expertise and resilience. Amina, a brilliant engineer from another world, became Kian's closest confidant in the mind. Behind many of their most daring operations, their secret base was hidden deep beneath the ruins of an abandoned city. Far from prying eyes, their strategies were debated, plans were made, and hope was rekindled. The rebels trained relentlessly, honing their skills for the battles yet to come. Kian often walked among them, a steady presence reminding everyone that their fight was not just for survival, but for freedom. The Empire's arrogance was its greatest weakness. It assumed that humans were weak, disorganized, and easily broken. It did not expect that a single man, once a prisoner, could ignite a revolution that threatened everything they controlled. This underestimation gave Kian and his rebels the advantage they needed. One night, a crucial opportunity arose. A high-ranking Varkon commander, disgruntled and ambitious, reached out secretly to Kian with a proposition: help him overthrow the council, and the humans would gain their freedom and much more. The offer was risky. Trust was a luxury few could afford, and betrayal was a constant threat. But Kian saw the chance to turn enemies into allies, to weaken the Empire from within. The negotiations were tense and secretive, held in the deepest shadows of the rebel base. Both sides understood the stakes. Success meant a chance to reshape the galaxy. Failure meant death and destruction for all involved. Kian's instincts, honed by months of hardship and loss, guided every word. Meanwhile, the Varkan Council sensed the growing unrest. Fear crept into their ranks. They increased patrols, doubled down on surveillance, and launched brutal raids to crush any hint of rebellion. Entire districts were razed, innocent lives sacrificed to send a message. But the harder they pressed, the stronger the human spirit became. Keon's plan moved forward with quiet precision. The rebels sabotaged supply lines, cut off communications, and prepared for a coordinated strike against the Empire's central command hub. It was a mission that could change everything, but it required courage, sacrifice, and absolute trust. As the day of the attack approached, tension gripped the rebel base. Every heart beat faster. Every shadow seemed a threat. Keon gathered his closest allies and spoke with calm determination, reminding them of what was at stake, not just their lives, but the future of humanity and all those who dreamed of freedom. The night before the mission, Keon stood alone, outside the rebel base, looking up at the stars. The same stars that once seemed distant and cold now felt like guides, shining with promise. He thought of Earth, of home, and of the people who had been lost. He made a silent vow. No matter the cost, he would see this fight through to the end. Battle was fierce and chaotic. Rebels moved like shadows through enemy corridors, disabling defenses and planting charges. Varkan soldiers fought with ruthless desperation, but they were unprepared for the skill and determination of Keon's forces. Explosions tore through the command hub, sending shockwaves that reverberated across the Empire. In the chaos, Keon faced the commander who had betrayed his own people. It was a fight not only of strength, but of will. The clash of ideals echoed louder than any weapon. In the end, Keon's resolve prevailed. The commander fell, and with him, the power of the corrupt council began to crumble. The victory was a turning point. The Empire was shaken to its core. Rebellion turned into revolution. Aliens and humans alike rose up, casting off the chains of oppression. But Keon knew this was only the beginning. The path ahead was uncertain and dangerous. New threats would emerge, and the cost of freedom was never cheap. Yet the fire inside, Keon and inside all who stood with him, burned brighter than ever. They had taken a human and made him a slave. But that human had taken their empire, and now nothing would ever be the same. The fall of the Council's command hub sent shockwaves throughout the Varkan Empire, shaking its core more violently than anyone had anticipated. For centuries, the Varkans had ruled with an iron fist, their authority absolute and unchallenged. But now cracks appeared in the once unbreakable facade. The Empire was no longer a monolith. It was fracturing. Keon's rebellion was the catalyst. In the days that followed, chaos swept across countless star systems. The Varkans, caught off guard by the sudden uprising, scrambled to contain the damage. Fleet after fleet was recalled, but the rebels struck with increasing precision and confidence. Every success fueled hope among the enslaved, while fear spread like wildfire among their oppressors. Keon stood at the center of this storm. His mind was sharp and focused. He had learned that winning a war was not just about battles and weapons, but about leadership and vision. He met with allies from different worlds, once enemies now united under a single banner. They discussed strategy, shared intelligence, and built the framework for a new future. Keon's voice carried the weight of hope, a promise that freedom was within reach, but the Varkans were not defeated yet. Their pride and thirst for power drove them to desperate measures. They unleashed terrifying new weapons designed to sow terror and chaos. Cities were bombarded from orbit. Entire populations were threatened with extinction to crush the rebellion's spirit. The war turned darker, more brutal. Keon refused to falter, pushed his people to persevere, even when the nights grew long and the losses piled high. In quiet moments, he thought about Earth's the blue planet that had been stolen from him. He promised himself that if he survived, he would return, not as a broken man, but as a conqueror. Amidst the chaos, internal struggles within the Varkan ranks worsened. Some began to question the Council's decisions, while others plotted for their own gain. Keon used these divisions to his advantage, forging secret alliances with discontented factions. His rebellion was no longer just a fight for survival. It was a war to seize control. The rebels' tactics grew bolder. Instead of hiding in shadows, they began to challenge the Varkan forces openly. Battles raged on barren moons, asteroid belts, and crowded space stations. Kian's leadership was put to the test in every conflict. He was forced to make impossible decisions that cost lives but advanced the cause. One of the most critical moments came when Kian's forces launched a surprise attack on a heavily fortified fortress known as the Heart of the Empire. It was the symbol of Varkan power, a place thought impossible to conquer. Yet with careful planning and fierce determination, the rebels infiltrated the fortress. Fierce hand-to-hand combat echoed through its halls. The battle was long and bloody, but the victory was a testament to the rebels' resolve. News of this triumph spread quickly. The enslaved and oppressed across the empire saw a new possibility of future where chains could be broken. Grip loosened, but their cruelty intensified in desperation. They retaliated with ruthless crackdowns, targeting civilian populations to sow fear. Kian's resolve hardened. He knew that winning hearts and minds was as important as winning battles. He reached out to alien communities, offering protection and hope. His message was clear. Freedom was not just for humans, but for all enslaved beings. This message united many disparate groups into a powerful coalition. As the war escalated and faced growing challenges from within, some rebel leaders grew impatient, eager for swift victory and willing to risk everything. Others doubted Kian's cautious approach. Tensions threatened to tear the rebellion apart from the inside. Kian worked tirelessly to maintain unity, reminding his people of the greater goal. In the quiet hours before dawn, Kian often found himself alone, reflecting on the journey so far. The weight of leadership was heavy, but the fire inside him burned brighter than ever. He had transformed from a broken slave into a symbol of defiance and hope. Yet the final battle loomed, a confrontation that would decide the fate of the empire. The council, sensing the danger, called upon their most fearsome warlords and commanders. They planned a massive counterattack to crush the rebellion once and for all. The stakes had never been higher. Kian prepared his people for the storm. He knew the coming battle would demand everything: courage, sacrifice, and unyielding will. As the fleets gathered and the armies marched, a new chapter in the war was about to begin. The enslaved would no longer be victims. They would become masters of their own destiny. The war had reached a boiling point. Kian stood on the bridge of the rebel flagship, eyes fixed on the dark expanse of space where the massive Varkan fleet awaited. The silence before the storm was thick with tension, but Kian felt something deeper. A fierce determination that had carried him through every impossible moment since his capture. The final strike was near, and he knew that everything his people's future. The fate of the empire would be decided here. For years, the Varkans had ruled with cruelty and pride, but now their empire trembled beneath the weight of rebellion. Kian had taken what once was stolen: his freedom, his honor, his home, and transformed it into a force that challenged the galaxy's greatest power. But this battle was unlike any before. The council had gathered their deadliest warriors, their most terrifying weapons, and their harshest tactics. This was their last chance to crush the rebellion. The rebel fleet was smaller, but fierce. Pilots, soldiers, and engineers from countless worlds stood united behind Kian's leadership. They had endured loss, betrayal, and pain. They had fought in shadows and in open battle. Now their hearts burned with hope and rage. Every man and woman knew what was at stake: not just victory, but survival. The command came. Ships surged forward like a tidal wave of metal and fire. Energy beams crackled across the void and explosions lit the darkness. The battle was brutal and chaotic. Rebel fighters darted between massive warships, dodging missiles and laser fire. The clang of metal, the roar of engines, and the cries of battle filled the void. Kian directed the fight with calm precision. He anticipated enemy moves, coordinated strikes, and inspired his fleet with unwavering courage. Every maneuver was a dance between life and death. The rebels pressed harder, using guerrilla tactics to offset their smaller numbers. On the ground, rebel forces stormed key Varkan installations. The fighting was fierce and unrelenting. Soldiers fought side by side with alien allies, breaking through walls and pushing deep into enemy territory. Keon's closest commanders relayed constant updates, their voices tense but hopeful. In the midst of battle, Keon faced his greatest personal challenge. The Varkon warlord who had once captured him, the man who had tried to break his spirit and enslave his soul, appeared on the battlefield. Their eyes met, two warriors shaped by conflict but divided by fate. The duel was fierce. Blades clashed, energy weapons hummed, and the outcome teetered on the edge of fate. Keon fought not just for himself, but for every soul the warlord had oppressed. Every strike was fueled by years of pain and the promise of freedom. Finally, with a powerful move, Keon disarmed the warlord and stood victorious. The symbol of Varkan cruelty fell before the very man they had tried to enslave. The rebel forces rallied behind this moment, their morale soaring as the tide of battle turned. Council's fleet faltered. Confusion and fear rippled through their ranks. Without leadership, their ships scattered or surrendered. The rebellion's victory was within reach, yet the cost was immense. Many brave souls had fallen. Cities lay in ruins, and the scars of war would not heal overnight. Keon stood among the survivors, his heart heavy but hopeful. He knew this was not the end. It was a new beginning. In the aftermath, the empire began to change. The old order collapsed, and the enslaved were no longer prisoners but leaders. Keon emerged not just as a hero but as a symbol of resistance and renewal. He vowed to rebuild the broken worlds, to bring justice and peace where there had been only fear. But the galaxy was vast and full of dangers yet unseen. New threats loomed on the horizon, and old enemies would not rest easily. Keon's journey was far from over. He would need all his strength, wisdom, and allies to protect the fragile hope they had won. As he looked to the stars, Keon felt the weight of destiny settle on his shoulders. He had taken an empire, but now he had to build a future worthy of the sacrifice. The enslaved had risen, the empire had fallen, and a new age was dawning. The silence after the final battle was almost as overwhelming as the fury that had preceded it. The Varkan Empire, once a towering colossus of fear and control, lay shattered across countless worlds. The war that had seemed endless had reached its close, and yet for Keon and those who followed him, true challenge was only beginning. Victory was not the end. It was the fragile start of rebuilding a future from the ashes of devastation. Keon stood on the surface of a scarred battlefield, the ground beneath his boots still trembling from the last explosions. Around him, the remnants of the Varkan forces scattered like broken shadows, their once proud war machines silent and lifeless. The sky, once darkened by the smoke of war, was beginning to clear, revealing stars that seemed to shine brighter than ever before. It was a sign, Keon thought, that hope could pierce even the deepest darkness. But the cost had been unimaginable. Thousands of lives lost, entire cities reduced to rubble, families torn apart by decades of tyranny and conflict. Keon felt the weight of every sacrifice like a heavy stone pressing down on his chest. He was no longer just a man who had escaped slavery. He was a leader responsible for thousands, for the future of a galaxy that had been chained for too long. In the days that followed, Keon traveled from planet to planet, speaking to the freed peoples, listening to their stories, and sharing a vision of unity and peace. He knew that freedom was more than the absence of chains. It was the presence of justice, equality, and hope. The new era he dreamed of would not come from conquest alone, but from healing and rebuilding. The former slaves, once scattered and fearful, began to come together under Keon's guidance. Together, they formed councils representing every race and culture that had suffered under the Varkans. Old enemies found common ground in their shared desire for a better tomorrow. Keon worked tirelessly to ensure that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. Power, he insisted, must be a tool for protection, not oppression. But peace was fragile. Even as the new governments formed, threats lingered. Warlords loyal to the old empire hid in the shadows, plotting to reclaim their lost dominion. Political rivals vied for influence, and the scars of mistrust ran deep. Keon faced new battles, not with weapons, but with words, diplomacy, and sometimes the hard choices that leadership demands. Throughout it all, Keon remained a symbol of resilience. His story, once one of pain and captivity, had become a beacon of hope. He never forgot the dark days in the cell, the cruelty he endured, or the faces of those who fought beside him. Those memories fueled his resolve to build a galaxy where no one would suffer as he had. One evening, as Keon looked out over a peaceful city rising from the ruins, a young child approached him. The child's eyes were full of wonder and questions. "Will we ever be truly free?" she asked softly. Keon smiled gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Freedom is not a place or a moment," he said. "It's a journey, one we walk together. We fight for it every day, in every choice we make. And as long as we keep walking, there is hope." The stars above twinkled like distant promises, and Keon felt the weight of the future lift just a little. The empire had been taken, but the true victory was the freedom to dream again. They had enslaved a human, but he had taken their empire and given birth to a new era. The story of Keon and his people was far from over. It was only just beginning.